amazing panel left. And I would like to, first of all, introduce our moderator for this last panel. That is Steve Sokol, the CEO and President of the American Council on Germany, who will be leading us through a panel entitled Democracy and the Individual. And hopefully you start seeing that there's a red thread to the Future Forum. We're bringing it all back to where we are in this moment in time. And we have with us today Hagenlocher from the United Nations University in Bonn, as well as Kumm, who is jointly, Mattias Kumm, Entschuldigung, who has a joint position at the Humboldt University, but also at NYU, and Anna-Bettina Kaiser, who is Professor of Public Law as well at Harvard Berlin as well, and also a visiting scholar currently here at NYU. So Steve, panelists, take us away. Thank you.
So just to make sure, this is number 2, right? You said, and then, Jan, can you give that mic to Michael? Yeah, give it to me. No, you have 5, so that goes to right. And then you have number 3. Yep, perfect. Okay. Vielen Dank, Jan. Good afternoon, everybody. And I know, as Jan said, you're probably all exhausted, a little exhausted after a very long day, but we wanted to have a very lively conversation to sort of perk you up and pull a couple threads together from the day, but also to prepare you for the night lab, where you can ask lots and lots of questions. So I'm very much looking forward to this panel. And as I was talking with Jan in the run-up to the event and sort of reflecting on the panel, I was reminded of a speech that I heard early on when I returned to New York to take on my current role at the American Council on Germany, that was given by the German permanent representative to the United Nations. And he talked about the fact, this was 7 or 8 years ago, he talked about the fact that we live in a VUCA world. And I was sort of, what does that mean, right? What's VUCA? What are you talking about? And he talked about volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity. And I'm not going to say it was the best speech that I've ever heard, but the notion of VUCA stuck with me. And particularly as I was thinking about today, and about the fact that we've made it through a pandemic, that there is conflict in Ukraine, that there's conflict in the Middle East, we are seeing even more volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity. And the question is sort of, how do we navigate that? How do we address that? How do we deal with that? And how does it affect us on a global level, but also on a national and on a societal level? And so I'm really excited with the way in which this panel has come together, because I think we'll be able to unpack sort of different strands of what's been discussed today, but also really get into some new things that haven't quite been addressed today. And I'd like to start with you, Michael, and have you sort of talk with us a little bit about how you see simultaneous crises, right? I don't know to what degree the word polycrisis has been mentioned repeatedly during the day, but how you see simultaneous crises on a global scale unfolding, and how that's affecting us.
Yeah, thank you very much. First of all, warm welcome also from my side, and thank you to the organizers. I think a very interesting panel. It's very rare that someone who works on risk and adaptation sits on a panel with 2 law experts. But actually, I hope that the conversation as it unfolds will show why that makes a lot of sense, and why it also makes sense to connect questions of systemic risks to the role of individuals and questions around democracy. Today we've heard a lot about different hazards, about different crises, about unexpected events and implications for resilience, but we haven't talked so much about interconnections and systemic risks. And what this image shows, and is emblematic for a wider issue that many countries, many regions, many communities across the globe face, is that in reality, many of those places are not only confronted with one hazard or one crisis or one shock, but they're confronted with multiple of them. As you can see here, people fighting with a flood event during an ongoing pandemic that has led to a double burden for risk management, for our ability to cope. If you have regulations that ask you to physically distance, but you have an extreme event that forces you to go to temporary shelter, are we prepared to deal with those questions? But it's actually, when we talk about complexity, it's more complex than that, because the effects of those hazards and crises and shocks, and this is something that we've experienced all firsthand over the last years, really, with the pandemic, for example, are not only felt for different sectors, for different communities, but across sectors, across systems, and across borders, really. And this has become very evident, for example, in the COVID pandemic, which has been far more than just a health crisis, has really affected societies to their core. But we're also seeing this, for example, with the terrible aggression of Russia on the Ukraine, which has led to very devastating impacts in the country, but also to cascading effects on food security in many parts of the world, on migration patterns, notably towards Europe, but also on energy security, but also questions of international diplomacy and international relations, and our ability to deal with other ongoing crises that have maybe become less visible. For example, WHO at the beginning of the war still talked about what was happening in Myanmar, who still talked about what was happening in Afghanistan, for example, and we see something very similar now with the ongoing war in the Middle East, that attention is shifting, and with that also questions of where do we put our focus when we want to build resilience. Yeah, I stop there, but I would like to maybe then later on come back to this and reflect a little bit on what it actually means for building resilience as our risks and the impacts become more systemic and more interconnected.
So I certainly think that we will come back to that after we've heard from everybody, but let me ask you just sort of a quick follow-up question, right? Because you've been at the sort of 30,000 foot level looking down. One of the things I'd like to ask you is about sort of people on the ground, because certainly through your work you see how people are affected, and not everybody in every society is affected the same way by the crisis. And so I'd like you to maybe talk about how different people in society are affected differently, because I think that will tie in as well to some of the other topics that we'll get to, particularly when we get to democracy.
Yeah, thank you very much. I think this is something that has been stressed by previous panelists earlier today, notably in the session on cities and climate. This whole notion of whenever we talk about and reflect upon strategies for strengthening or building resilience, that it needs to be based on a very deep understanding of problems. And I think one of the problems is that indeed that the effects of these hazards, crises and shocks are not equally distributed, but it's the most vulnerable segments of society that usually carry the highest burden. So we've all, again, I think we've all experienced that firsthand during the pandemic, when we think about the direct impacts of COVID-19, for example, that there were certain at-risk groups, right? The elderly or those with pre-existing health conditions. But if we spin this a little bit further and think about what were the implications, for example, of lockdowns that governments had put in place to reduce the further spread of the disease, that has revealed an additional layer of vulnerabilities in our society. For example, a big divide between the rich and the poor when it comes to access to online education. So those that were maybe already vulnerable or marginalized or disadvantaged before the pandemic, these vulnerabilities have actually been exacerbated. And I think the same, there's a million stories also when you think about climate change. We've heard today people talk about heat, I think. There we also know that there's a certain vulnerable segment of society, again, the elderly, maybe those living alone, not having access to social networks, maybe no air conditioning. And I think it's very important that we don't generalize, so that we really understand what makes people vulnerable, and then look at what are the root causes of this as well, and try to address this with our resilience strategies, because else we risk that we remain palliative with our solutions. Yeah.
So that last line is actually a great bridge to bring Mattias into the conversation, because we've heard from Michael sort of what the scope of challenges are, and I'd like to tie those crises into the title of the Future Forum, which of course focuses on resilience as well. Obviously, over the course of the day, there's been a lot of conversation about resilience. But why do you think resilience is such a critical topic today?
I find it fascinating that in an event such as this one, which is on the one hand geared for a general audience and is called Future Forum, the topic is resilience. And here's why. So in 2019, just as a little anecdote, I went to Beijing, and one of the things I did, I visited the National Museum in China, which had a special exhibition which was called Great Changes, and was on the last 40 years of development since opening up. And at the end of the exhibition, there was a large part which focused on promising futures. And in that part of the exhibition, you had exhibits related to Chinese space exploration, exploration of massive health, possibilities of massive health improvements through DNA editing and cell rejuvenation, and so on and so on. And you walked through there, and as you walked through there, I'm really no great friend of the Chinese system, but it was difficult not to get a sense of, wow, something is really happening here. This is moving forward. And if you're a Chinese citizen, I can easily imagine how the effect of all of this would be to say, I want to be part of this. I want to move forward along with part of this. And I think this was the kind of sentiment that for a long time, for a large part of the world, was associated with the hope of liberal democracy and the Western world, the transatlantic world. And I think that has disappeared. There is not much of a perspective, there's not much of a horizon, a transformative, progressive, emancipatory horizon with regard to the future. Resilience is about safeguarding and somehow and being responsive to threats of various kinds. It's basically focused on something that instills fear on us. So it's about responding intelligently to things that we fear. So to come up with a concrete example again, imagine the issue is really you live in an apartment that you're not too happy with. You actually like a nicer apartment, a larger one in a nicer area, etc. But then the topic shifts, and it's not about how you can have a better apartment and live a better life. It's about, take care, you got to be resilient. Do you have what it takes to protect yourself against fire? Because, that might burn down. And then the question is, how was the house built? Has it been properly built to ensure that the fire hazard has been limited? So that's resilient on one level. So let's go to the different levels of resilience. That's resilience on one level. You build a house to make sure that there is no fire. The second is, even if there is a fire, are you going to create possibilities for those who inhabit it to deal with this effectively and get out? So for example, maybe you have sprinklers, you have a fire alarm, a detector of smoke, and of course you have the fire service come hopefully and put out any fire that there might be. That's resilience, but once the fire happens. And then the third level is resilience once the house burns down. So have you bought insurance? Do you have a place to stay? Have you put up some money? And so when we talk about resilience, we can talk about these different levels. And the question is, so first of all, when we talk about resilience, we don't really talk about transformative futures. We talk about threats. And when we talk about threats, we ought to be very careful on which level we're focused. And I think there are many types of crisis we are facing where there is something misguided or weird about focusing on this last stage, when disaster already has happened, the house is burned down. There are many contexts where that would be crazy to do. So think about war and peace. Think about Ukraine. Think about the tensions with regard to Taiwan as they might emerge. And so we can think about this kind of crisis in a variety of ways. We can say, on the one hand, we want to have an international system that has the capacity to effectively address challenges. difference of interests, different geostrategic perspectives, what have you. And then we want to have a situation, if that crisis is not, if the challenge is not contained, if it becomes a crisis, let's say there is some kind of an armed conflict, then you want that to be contained. You want there to be high-level contacts all along, all the way, to ensure that it doesn't escalate into some major global catastrophe. So that's kind of the second level. And then there's a third level, imagine it comes to the worst. Now this is something that the probability of this, I hope, is very, very low. But if it happens, it's as disastrous as anything that humanity has ever experienced. So let it be 2 to 5% in the next 30 years, which I think is more optimistic than pessimistic. And that the scenario there, of course, is disaster, and focusing on resilience to address the outcome of such an awful scenario, I think is awfully defeatist. So I think all the energy, really, I mean 99% of the energy in this kind of context should be directed towards creating an international system where challenges and differences of interests do not evolve into armed conflict, and if it does evolve into armed conflict, where it's structurally close to impossible for it to escalate into a nuclear exchange.
So, great response, and let me maybe do the same thing with you that I did with Michael, of bring you down from the geopolitical high level, and let's talk about the individuals a little bit, because I'm still thinking about that exhibit in Beijing that you saw, and the transformative future that was held up as a sign of hope for many people who live there. What does that mean for the hopes and dreams of people who live in democratic societies? Sort of this eating away at the future, right? That I'm making my life more resilient so I can deal with all of these crises, is more dealing with concerns and not really dealing with those hopes and dreams.
There is a characteristic focus, I think, in our culture on kind of burdening the individual with now becoming resilient. There are mindfulness exercises, there's health, there's mental health, there are all kinds of issues, and none of that is wrong, and all of that has its role to play. But we have to understand that kind of focus is one that ultimately is defeatist, because it's not focused on the structural conditions that create these problems in the first place. So with regard to the context of the individual in a democratic society, I think all of us as citizens of wherever we are have good reasons to help, on the one hand, to build and support the working infrastructure of liberal democracies. That includes education, that includes being very careful as to how we design and structure the public sphere. I have a lot to say about social media regulation, if anybody care to hear. I'm not going to do that now. It matters how the electoral system is structured, how it can deal with challenges, and so that's the level I would first of all focus on. Once you have that safe and secure, then there's at least a premise, the starting point to develop a wider vision in how a better future might be structured.
Thank you. So Anna-Bettina, let's bring you in. I mean, we were talking about this a little bit before we came up to the stage. A decade ago, we probably would not have been having a conversation about democracy at an event that dealt with crisis and resilience, right? I think maybe on many levels, we took democracy for granted. So can you talk a little bit about why we're having this discussion right now, and why so many people are losing confidence in democratic institutions and practices?
Yes, this is what strikes me most. How come that we now have on a conference on crisis a democracy panel? That would have been unthinkable, right? And now, maybe since a decade, we now have colleagues that write books like with the title "How Democracies Die." That's now what we deal with. And they write, yeah, it's not about coups anymore, military coups. It's about democratically the elected incumbents that all of a sudden don't accept elections anymore. It's about, for example, think of Germany, more than 50% that answer in a survey by the Bonn University that they are not satisfied with the democracy in Germany anymore. We have, or if you look at the Wieden report, then you find it's now 72% of the world's population that doesn't live in democratic countries anymore. And they say, concerning democracy, we are now on a level back in 1986. So it's exactly what Mattias just told us, while after the fall of the Iron Curtain, people wanted to be part of the democratic project. This has changed. And now we all ask ourselves, how can that happen? What are the reasons for that? And I have to say, me as a lawyer, I can't answer that question. I have to rely on the social sciences. And to be honest, my impression is they don't know. They come up with a lot of possible answers. So, for example, one answer is, of course, the rising inequality in societies, but then you find other data that say no, but while we have talked so long about that famous or notorious elephant chart that has been reversed, so maybe it isn't inequality. Is it maybe the overload due to globalization? So the concrete reasons we really don't know. But as a lawyer, now my profession comes in, we want to know what can we do if we think of democracy and resilience. Is there a way that we can rethink our constitutions in a way that we exactly can avoid the result that Ziblatt and Levitsky in their book How Democracies Die, that we avoid such a thing. So can we somehow rethink, maybe add to our constitutions elements that make them stronger, that so that we can really keep our constitutional democracies. And so I want just to mention some elements. But before I start, a little proviso. So there is a famous saying by Kurt Gödel, the famous logician, from 1947. So when he took the exam to become a US citizen, he said to Einstein, well, I found out that there is no safe constitution. Even, he said, a dictator even the US constitution can become a dictatorial constitution. So that's an insight. We can't build constitutions in such a way that they are super safe. But we can still think of elements that make them more resilient. And Mattias has already mentioned some elements. So I think we really have to think of how to deal with disinformation and hate speech. And I think this is also a very interesting topic concerning the transatlantic dialogue, because it's one of the few topics where there really seems to be a disagreement, right? While the European perspective would say, yes, we go on, we try to stop disinformation, we try to stop hate speech. For example, with the German Network Enforcement Act that forces the social networks to take down hate speech, and the European legislation has followed the German model. The US perspective is rather to say, no, that's protected by freedom of speech, and somehow it's the free marketplace of ideas that will come up with a solution. It's not the state the state must not intervene. That would be super dangerous. And so I think this is really a task for the transatlantic dialogue to talk about that and to find common solutions, to find bridges. second element might be militant democracy. So you might ask, or those of you who are not lawyers might ask, what is militant democracy? And militant democracy was somehow invented by Karl Löwenstein, an immigrant, in 1937 in the face of Nazi dictatorship, and he asked, isn't there a chance for democracies to fight for its values and not to hand in the power to the fascists? And he said, well, let's think about party bans. Let's think of the forfeiture of basic rights. Let's think about banning extremist associations. And it's interesting that the Basic Law has really incorporated most of these ideas. And one could argue, at least on a symbolic value, on a symbolic level, that this makes maybe the German constitution more resilient.
Let me ask you an immediate follow-up to that, which keeps me awake at night, and that is, how does one in that case deal with a fundamentally anti-democratic party which is democratically elected?
Well, actually, the more you think about militant democracy, the more difficult it becomes. First of all, when reading maybe Löwenstein for the first time, you think, well, he's so right, that's good. But then, after a while, you think maybe there is a paradox of militant democracy, and that paradox is, if you have, let's say, a very small anti-democratic party, you might think of banning it, but one could argue, why bother? Yeah, they won't have success anyway. So you don't need militant democracy in that moment. Or you have a super anti-democratic party that has maybe 30–40% of the population. Is it then realistic to ban such a party? And even if you ban it, what happens to the 40% of the population that adhere to its ideas? So in that moment you see you can't ban it anymore. And that, of course, shows the ambivalence of the concept. So we've just talked before, and we agreed that maybe militant democracy might be important on a symbolic level, so that people know, well, that's part of our constitution. Our constitution fights for democracy. Thank you.
Mattias definitely wants to jump in on this.
Just to be very concrete, there are elements of militant democracy in the American Constitution too.
Yeah.
So the 14th Amendment, which was enacted in the context of the Civil War, basically says that people who were participating, I don't have the exact legal formulation now, but in treasonous behavior, which meant that they fought on the other side, but it applies generally, it's not just linked to the Civil War, can be prevented from running for any kind of office, any kind of federal office again. So it would have been possible to prohibit Trump from running again if one believed that he was engaged in treasonous behavior on January 6th.
And there are some, even members of the Federalist Society, who agree with that.
Who agree with that reading, yes.
Right, with that interpretation, or with that reading, yeah.
I would like to quickly come in on those perspectives. I think there's so much that we can discuss, but I think one of the challenges that comes with the fact that we're confronted with systemic risks is that yes, we can do something about it as individuals to a certain degree, right? So with our behavior, we can either exacerbate risks, exacerbate impacts, we can contribute to climate change, or we can help reduce the impacts. But there's boundaries to that. And this means that we also need collective action. We need to collaborate. And I think one of the questions that comes with what you just said is with this trend towards more autocratic regimes. This is maybe a bit extreme in the formulation, but for certain countries this certainly applies. If you think about what happened in Brazil before, or what happened in the Philippines, and so on and so on, that this also poses a threat to international collaboration and the multi-level governance that we actually need to, as a world, deal with those systemic challenges that we cannot deal with alone or as single countries. I think that's one very important aspect. The second one, to be a little bit devil's advocate here on the resilience concept, is that we should not and must not forget that also when it comes to global collaboration on dealing with crisis, and here I can maybe refer to the efforts against terror, that we have a long history of actually counting on the resilience of autocratic regimes to be stable in a certain sense, as reliable partners, for example, to help us address those challenges. And I think what we're seeing now in Niger and in other parts of the world is that this is a very risky strategy. So we need to be very careful to not overstretch the use of the word resilience and to be very precise in terms of what we mean with it. Yeah.
No, I mean, I think that's a great point, and obviously there is so much to unpack here. There's so much more to talk about. Jan is giving me looks that it's time.
Not my fault.
No, I know it's not your fault. I know it's not your fault. We had wanted to sort of close this out by talking about some possible solutions in a more structured way, but I think that we have, right? I mean, Michael brought up collaboration, greater collaboration in terms of addressing some of these problems. Mattias, in a side note, talked about education and the importance of education in trying to deal with some of these issues. And Anna-Bettina was talking about sort of more resilient constitutions, frameworks, having the legal guardrails to really sort of avoid some things getting out of control. And I think each of those things are things that could merit, a conversation on their own, and that would be a very important thing. But there are things that we can be doing. And let me just add a fourth one, picking up on the social media comment, picking up on your comment about hate speech as well. I think media literacy is sort of at the core of this, in this time of disinformation. How do people consume the information that they consume, and what are the conclusions that they draw for it? But maybe, if everybody who's here takes away sort of a little piece of any one of those elements, there are things that we can do to try to address some of these challenges. I wish we could continue, but Jan is ready to give us our instructions.